Larkspur Basin, Wyoming Territory, 1886. Nathaniel Voss did not hire men off the road, and every hand on the Split Anvil knew it well enough to say so behind his back. But the man standing at the gate that April morning had a horse gone lame under him and a saddle worn thin in the particular way that comes from years spent moving, rather than staying. And something about the set of his jaw made Nathaniel step down off the porch himself, instead of sending the foreman to turn him away. "Name's Gideon Pratt," the man said, not offering his hand first, the way most drifters did when they wanted work badly enough to make themselves agreeable. "Heard you're short at roundup." Nathaniel looked him over the way he looked over horses at auction, thoroughly and without unkindness. 26 years old, maybe 28. A forearm scarred and healed a little crooked. Boots resoled twice over. "You heard right," Nathaniel said. "You know cattle?" "I know cattle." "You know trouble?" A pause, longer than the question warranted. "I've had my share of that too. Didn't go looking for most of it." Nathaniel hired him within the hour, over the plain objection of his foreman, Amos Teague, who stood in the yard with his arms crossed like a man watching a mistake walk in on two legs. Nobody at Split Anvil could have said, that first morning, what had made an old rancher with 40 years of hard-earned judgment take on a stranger nobody could vouch for. Nathaniel himself could not have said it plainly, not yet, though something in his chest had gone tight and quiet the moment the young man gave his name. The way a man's chest goes tight when a door he believed shut for good swings open again without warning. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Gideon Pratt had grown up on a hardscrabble grain farm outside Council Bluffs, raised by a childless couple named Pratt who had taken him in as an infant through a county placement agent and never once let him wonder whether he was loved. They had been honest with him about the rest of it. He had come to them with no papers beyond a note pinned to his blanket giving only a first name and a birth month, and a small sum of money that arrived twice a year from a lawyer's office in Cheyenne, with no letter attached and no name signed to it. Money that stopped coming the year he turned 18 and struck out on his own. He had spent 8 years since working cattle from the nations up through the Dakotas, and at 3 different outfits he had been let go under a cloud that was never quite proven and never quite disproven either. Once for a missing purse that turned up later in another man's bedroll, once for a fight he had not started, once for no reason anyone gave him at all beyond a foreman who did not care for his face. He had learned, by 26, not to explain himself to men who had already decided. He worked, he kept his own counsel, and he moved on before trouble found him twice in the same place. Nathaniel Voss had built the Split Anvil out of 11,000 acres of Larkspur Basin grass over 4 decades, and buried a wife in it, and raised a daughter in it, and in the last 2 winters had begun to feel his own age the way a man feels weather coming before it arrives. His daughter Celia was 24 and ran the household accounts with a sharper eye than most bankers, and had inherited her father's habit of watching a person's hands before she trusted their words. She did not like Gideon Pratt from the first afternoon she saw him in the yard, breaking a green colt with a patience that unsettled her more than temper would have. Because temper she understood and quiet competence in a stranger she did not. "You don't know a thing about him," she told her father that evening, setting his supper down harder than the plate required. "Not where he's from, not why 3 other outfits let him go. Nothing. I know he can gentle a horse without raising his voice once," Nathaniel said. "That tells a man plenty, if he's willing to look. It tells you he's good at appearing harmless." Nathaniel did not argue the point further, though something in his face, Celia would think later, had looked for a moment like a man holding a much larger thought behind a much smaller one, the way a person sets down a heavy trunk just inside a door, rather than carrying it the whole way in at once. The foreman, Amos Teague, made his own opinion known within the first week, assigning Gideon the worst stretch of fence line and the least forgiving horses in the remuda, watching for the complaint that never came. Roland Voss, Nathaniel's nephew and the son of his late brother, arrived at Split Anvil that same week from Laramie, where he had spent the better part of a decade failing at 3 separate ventures on money his uncle had quietly supplied each time, and took one look at the new hand and decided, the way certain men decide things instantly and permanently, that here was a rival worth destroying before it became one worth respecting. "Uncle Nathaniel's getting soft in his age," Roland said to Amos Teague, loud enough to carry across the bunkhouse porch to where Gideon sat mending a bridle. Hiring drifters nobody can name a reference for. Man could be anybody. Could be running from a rope. Could be, Gideon said, without looking up from the leather in his hands. Man could also be minding his own business and letting other men mind theirs. Roland's face colored, and he said nothing further that evening. But he remembered the answer, and men like Roland Voss did not forget being answered in front of hired help. Word of a stranger working the Split Anvil traveled through Larkspur Basin the way most news traveled that spring. Slower than gossip, but faster than fact. By the second month, half the county had an opinion on Gideon Pratt, formed from nothing more than his unfamiliar face and his habit of saying little. A rumor took root that he had done time in a territorial jail somewhere south. Another held that he had left a wife behind him in Nebraska, under circumstances nobody could quite specify, but everybody seemed certain were shameful. Neither rumor had a single fact underneath it, and neither rumor slowed down for wanting one. Nathaniel's health had begun failing the previous autumn, a cough that would not clear, and a tiredness that settled into his bones by mid-afternoon, regardless of how little he had done that day, and he had told no one outside the family how much worse it had gotten over the winter. He kept working the ranch from horseback as long as his legs would carry him, and when they would not, he watched from the porch instead, and it was from the porch in early May that he watched Gideon Pratt do the thing that first told him, plainly, what kind of man had walked through his gate. A sudden hailstorm caught the spring roundup strung out along Cutbank Creek, and the herd bolted before any of the 6 hands working it could turn the leaders. Cattle went crashing down the creek bank in a panic that could have drowned a third of the herd and killed a man besides, and it was Gideon who put his horse into the water first, riding the flank of the Stampede in the driving hail until he could bend the leaders back upstream, working alone for the better part of 10 minutes, before Amos Teague and 2 others managed to reach him and turn the rest. When it was over, Gideon had a gash above one eyebrow from a low branch he had not seen coming and had lost his hat somewhere in the current, and he said nothing about either, dismounting to check the count as though the last 10 minutes had been an ordinary afternoon's work. Nathaniel watched the whole thing from the porch with a spyglass his late wife had once used for watching hawks, and when Amos Teague came up that evening to report the herd whole and only 4 head lost to the storm instead of 40, Nathaniel asked him a single question. Who went in first? The Pratt did, Amos said, and something in his own voice had shifted, though he was not yet ready to say so plainly to the man himself. Went in before any of us had our wits about us. Didn't wait to be told. Roland did not soften after the creek, though every other hand who had watched the water that day did. If anything, the Stampede sharpened his resentment, because a man who had wanted Gideon Pratt small and forgettable now had to watch him become, within a single afternoon, the story every hand at Split Anvil told when the subject of the new man came up in town. Roland began, that summer, to press his case more openly, and in July he found his moment in front of an audience large enough to matter. The county held its midsummer gathering at the Grange Hall outside Larkspur proper, the one occasion each year when every outfit for 30 miles turned out together. Ranchers and hands and their families crowded around long tables under paper lanterns, and it was there, in front of nearly the whole basin, that Roland chose to make his accusation loud enough to carry. He had heard, he announced to a knot of men near the punch table, that the Nebraska wife rumor was not rumor at all, but plain fact, that Gideon Pratt had left a woman and a debt behind him under a different name entirely, and that Nathaniel Voss was a fool for letting such a man anywhere near his daughter or his ledgers. The hall went quiet enough that Gideon, standing near the door with his hat already in his hands out of habit, heard every word of it plainly. He did not raise his voice in answer. He crossed the room instead, slow and unhurried, until he stood close enough to Roland that the whole gathering could hear him without either man shouting. I've never set foot in the state of Nebraska in my life, Gideon said. You're welcome to write to any outfit I've worked for and ask them yourself, rather than telling a room what you've heard secondhand from men who've never met me either. I'd think a Voss would want better proof than gossip before he put a man's name in the dirt in front of his neighbors. Roland had no answer ready, and the silence that followed him was the kind that stayed with a man longer than any shouted argument would have, because half the room had watched him reach for a weapon that turned out to be empty in his own hand. Nathaniel, seated near the back with Celia beside him, said nothing aloud, but Celia felt her father's hand tighten once on the arm of his chair, and understood, without either of them saying so, that something in him had settled that night into a decision he had not yet spoken. The lawyer's visits from Cheyenne grew more frequent after that summer. Alden Whitcomb riding out every few weeks through August and September on business. Nathaniel described only as ranch matters when Celia asked. Nathaniel had also begun, in those same weeks, to teach Gideon things a hired hand had no ordinary reason to learn. The full boundary survey of Split Anvil's 11,000 acres. The history of the water rights along Cutbank Creek that 3 prior lawsuits had nearly cost the family. The standing of the ranch within the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and what that standing was worth in years the open range grew thinner. Gideon absorbed all of it the way he absorbed everything, without asking the question that would have been obvious to anyone watching from outside the two of them, which was why an old man dying by degrees would spend his remaining strength teaching a fence rider the whole architecture of an estate that was not his to inherit. Celia watched the pattern longer than either man realized, and it was in early September, mending a bridle on the porch while her father slept through an afternoon that had become his habit, that she said aloud to Gideon the thing she had been turning over for weeks. "He teaches you the way he once tried to teach me," she said. "Before he decided I already knew enough of it. Except with you he starts from the beginning every time, like a man making sure nothing gets left out before he runs out of afternoons to say it in." Gideon set down the length of rein he had been working. "I've wondered at it," he admitted. "Didn't seem my place to ask why." "Maybe it's time you did," Celia said, and did not explain further, because she had begun, by then, to suspect a shape to the answer she was not yet willing to say aloud to a man who had spent 3 months treated as a stranger by nearly everyone in the basin, herself included. 2 nights after that conversation, Celia rode out alone to check a line shack on the far edge of Split Anvil ground and did not return by dark. Nathaniel, too weak by then to ride further than the barn himself, sent Gideon after her without a second thought, and Gideon found her horse tied and Celia herself standing off 3 riders she did not know, men working the fringe of the basin who had already run 4 head of Split Anvil stock into a box canyon and clearly meant to run more before sunrise. Gideon did not draw on them first. He rode in slow, hands visible, and talked the way he had talked to spooked cattle all his life, low and even, until the leader of the 3 decided the risk of a fight over 4 head of stock in the dark was not worth whatever trouble a territorial posse might bring down on them by morning. They rode off empty-handed, and Gideon walked the recovered cattle back himself, while Celia rode alongside him, neither of them saying much until they were within sight of the house. "You could have been shot standing between me and 3 armed men," Celia said finally. "You didn't know me well enough to owe me that." "Didn't need to know you well," Gideon said. "Only needed to know you were standing where trouble was headed, and that I could put myself there instead." He looked over at her in the dark. Man doesn't always need a good reason to do the plain right thing. Sometimes the doing is the whole of the reason. Celia said nothing further that night, but she rode the rest of the way home thinking that a man who spoke that plainly about doing right, without asking what it earned him, was not a man 3 months of county gossip had ever once accurately described. Word of the Rustlers turned back reached town faster than either of them had ridden, the way ranch news always did, and by the following Sunday, the county's opinion of Gideon Pratt had begun the slow work of turning over on itself. The same neighbors who had repeated the Nebraska rumor at the Grange Hall now repeating instead the plainer, truer account of a hired hand who had ridden into the dark after another man's daughter without so much as drawing his pistol first. Reputation in Larkspur Basin had never moved quickly in either direction, but it had, that autumn, finally begun moving in his. Even Amos Teague, who had assigned him the worst fence line in April out of nothing more than an old foreman's caution, had started nodding to him across the yard each morning instead of merely counting his hours. A small courtesy that cost the older man nothing, and told Gideon plainly enough that the ground beneath him had shifted, even if neither of them had yet found the words to say so out loud. Around the halfway mark of this story, if you're hooked so far, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Within days of the rustler business, Nathaniel's health worsened past what he could keep hidden any longer, and Dr. Ansel Rayburn, riding out from town twice a week, told Celia plainly that her father's heart was failing and that the coming winter was not one he expected the old man to see through to spring. Nathaniel took the news with the same flat composure he brought to a bad cattle count and began, in the weeks after, to spend long private hours with his lawyer, Alden Whitcomb, hours nobody else in the household was invited to share. He also began spending his failing strength on Gideon specifically, in ways that struck the hand himself as unaccountable kindness from a man who owed him nothing. Nathaniel taught him the whole history of Split Anvil's water rights on a single long afternoon that left the old man exhausted for 2 days afterward. He gave Gideon his own late father's pocket watch, unprompted, for no occasion Gideon could name. And one late September evening, sitting on the porch while Gideon changed a wagon wheel below, Nathaniel asked him a question he had clearly been circling for months. "Your mother," Nathaniel said. "Did the Pratts ever tell you anything of her?" Gideon looked up, wrench still in hand. "Only that she was young and unmarried, and that whoever the father was, he had money enough to pay for her care and mine both. Quietly, through a lawyer, for as long as it lasted." He set the wrench down. "Strange question for a man to ask a hired hand, if you don't mind my saying so." "I don't mind," Nathaniel said, and looked out over the darkening basin for a long moment before he spoke again. "A man reaches a certain age, and he starts wondering what he left unfinished. That's all it is." It was not all it was, and Nathaniel knew it even as he said it, but he was not ready yet to say the rest, and he died 3 weeks later without having said it to Gideon directly, though he had, by then, said it in full to Alden Whitcomb, in a signed and witnessed codicil that would keep until the reading. Nathaniel Voss passed in his sleep on the 2nd of October, and Split Anvil observed the plain, unshowy mourning of a ranching county that had lost a man most of them respected more than they had ever told him outright. The funeral drew neighbors from 30 miles in every direction, and Gideon stood at the back of the church among the other hands, hat in his own 2 hands, saying nothing, the way he said nothing about most things that mattered to him. What no one at Split Anvil expected, 3 days later, was the letter that arrived at the bunkhouse, addressed specifically to Gideon Pratt, in Alden Whitcomb's careful hand, requesting his presence at the reading of Nathaniel Voss's will in the parlor of the main house on Thursday next, alongside the family. Amos Teague read the address twice before handing it over, and Roland Voss, hearing of it within the hour, laughed once, sharply, and declared to anyone in earshot that some clerical mistake had clearly been made, and that he intended to see it corrected before Thursday. It was not corrected. Thursday came, and the parlor filled with the family and the lawyer and, at the room's uneasy edge, Gideon Pratt, standing rather than sitting, his hat in his hands exactly as it had been at the funeral. Roland sat nearest the lawyer's chair, dressed for an occasion he had already, in his own mind, decided the outcome of. Celia sat across from him, her mother's old shawl around her shoulders, watching Gideon with an expression that was no longer suspicion and had not yet settled into anything she could have named. Alden Whitcomb opened the will with the unhurried formality of a man who had read a great many wills to a great many families, and had learned, from long practice, exactly how much silence a room could bear before words became necessary. He read the standard bequests first, small sums to the church, to Amos Teague for his years of service, a horse and saddle to a nephew's son. Roland's patience thinned visibly with each line that was not his own name, until Whitcomb reached the final section and set down the first page with a care that made Celia's stomach turn cold before a single word of it had been spoken. "The remainder of this document," Whitcomb said, "concerns a codicil executed and witnessed on the 14th of September of this year, in Nathaniel Voss's own hand, which I am instructed to read aloud in full and without interruption." He read it in full. He read that 40 years earlier, as a young man not yet master of Split Anvil, Nathaniel Voss had loved a schoolteacher named Ruth Colby, and that a child had come of that love whom family pressure and a father's disapproval had made it impossible for Nathaniel to claim openly at the time. A shame he had carried every year since and never spoken aloud to a living soul until this document. He read that the child had been placed, through a lawyer's careful and anonymous arrangement, with a farming family named Pratt outside Council Bluffs, and that support had been sent twice yearly until the boy's 18th year, at which point, believing the young man settled and independent, Nathaniel had let the connection lapse, rather than risk disrupting a life built without him. He read that when a drifter calling himself Gideon Pratt had appeared at the Split Anvil gate the previous April, Nathaniel had recognized him within the hour, by a birthmark at the base of the left thumb identical to Ruth Colby's own, and by a resemblance in the set of the jaw that 40 years had not erased, and that he had chosen, deliberately, to say nothing and watch instead, because he had wanted, before he died, to know his son's character from the man's own conduct, rather than from a lawyer's document or a father's hopeful assumption. The room did not move. Somewhere behind Celia, a clock she had never before noticed ticking made itself suddenly, unbearably audible. Roland's mouth had opened at some point during the reading and had not yet closed. Whitcomb read the final lines without lifting his eyes from the page, his voice steady in the particular way of a man determined to finish a hard thing cleanly. Nathaniel Voss left the whole of the Split Anvil, its land, its cattle, and its accounts, in equal and undivided partnership to his daughter Celia Voss and his son Gideon Voss, born Pratt, naming both by his own name, in the document's final line, the first time either of them had seen his hand write the word son next to Gideon at all. Gideon stood exactly where he had been standing when the reading began, his hat still in both hands, and said nothing, because there was, for the length of that silence, nothing in him that could be shaped into words. It was Roland who broke first. "This is a forgery," he said, too loud for the small room, his voice cracking on the second word. "An old man's fever dream, written down by a lawyer paid to humor him. I'll contest it in every court in the territory, before I let a drifter's bastard walk off with what should be mine. The codicil was witnessed by Dr. Rayburn and by myself, on a day your uncle was of clearer mind than most men half his age," Whitcomb said, without raising his own voice at all, which somehow made the correction land harder than shouting would have. "I would remind you, Mr. Voss, that you have never held any claim to this estate beyond your uncle's ongoing generosity, which he extended to you 3 times over ventures of your own making, and which this document does not so much as mention." Roland stood, and for a moment it looked as though he might say something further, something that could not be walked back once said in front of the room. But whatever it was, he swallowed it, and instead looked once, with open contempt, at Gideon, and left the parlor without another word, his boots loud on the floorboards in a way his voice had failed to be. The silence he left behind him was different from the one that had come before, and it was Amos Teague of all people who broke it, rising from his chair by the wall and crossing the room to where Gideon stood. "Went into that creek first, back in May," Amos said, quiet enough that it was meant for Gideon alone, though the whole room heard it anyway. "Didn't ask whose herd it was or whose orders. Just went. Man doesn't need a name on a document to prove what kind of man he is. I knew it back in May. Took the rest of this county longer." Celia crossed the room next and stood in front of the man she had spent 3 months distrusting on instinct and the last month admiring against her own will, and found, now that the moment had finally arrived, that she had almost nothing to say that felt equal to it. "You knew," she said finally. "Some part of you must have known. The way he kept seeking you out, the questions he asked. I knew he asked strange questions for a man who owed me nothing," Gideon said. "I didn't let myself think past that. A man in my position learns not to hope for things that big. Costs too much when they don't come true." "They came true," Celia said. "Half of them," Gideon said, and something in his face, for the first time since April, came apart just slightly. "I got a father I never knew I had, for 6 months, and lost him 3 weeks after he decided to tell me. That's not the kind of true a man knows how to be grateful for right away." Word of the reading traveled through Larkspur Basin the way the Nebraska rumor once had, only faster, and this time it carried nothing false in it to slow it down. Dr. Rayburn, who had witnessed the codicil himself and said as much to anyone who asked, told the story plainly enough at the Mercantile that within a week most of the county had stopped repeating the old suspicions and started instead repeating the plain, provable fact of what a dying man had chosen to put his own name to. The hands who had once assigned Gideon their worst tasks out of simple distrust began, without much being said about it, to defer to him the way men defer to someone whose judgment they have already tested and found sound, will or no will. He was not grateful right away. In the weeks that followed, Gideon moved through Split Anvil the way a man moves through a house he has just learned was always partly his, cautious of touching things too plainly, unsure yet what he had a right to. He kept working the fence lines and the branding same as before, because he did not know, at first, how else to occupy the hours that used to belong entirely to a hired hand's plain obligations. Amos Teague, who had assigned him the worst stretches of fence that first summer out of simple distrust, now rode those same stretches alongside him without being asked, and said little about it, which was, from Amos, its own kind of apology. Roland made good on his threat to contest the will, and lost, decisively and publicly, before a territorial judge in Cheyenne who found the codicil sound in every particular, and Roland's own conduct toward the estate, in the years leading up to it, worth noting unfavorably in his ruling. Roland left Larkspur Basin that winter and did not return, and the county's opinion of him, which had never been especially warm, cooled further with every account that traveled back of the hearing. Celia and Gideon ran Split Anvil together through that first hard winter as partners in the plainest sense the word could carry, splitting decisions the way their father had once split his own attention between a ranch and a grief he had never spoken of until it was nearly too late to speak of it at all. It was slow going between them at first, the ordinary caution of two people who had spent half a year deciding what the other was not, before either could quite believe what the other actually was. It was Celia, in February, standing in the barn while Gideon worked a stubborn latch on a stall door, who said the thing neither of them had yet found a plain way to say. "I spent 3 months certain you were hiding something shameful," she said. "Turns out you were only hiding a father too proud and too late to claim you himself. I owe you an apology for the 3 months. I think, longer than I've been willing to give one." "You owe me nothing," Gideon said. "You'd have been a fool to trust a stranger on faith alone. I wouldn't have thought better of you for it." "I don't want your forgiveness for being careful," Celia said. "I want to say plainly that I was wrong about the man underneath the caution, and that I'd like the chance to be right about him instead, if you'll let me." He did let her, and by spring the whole basin had stopped calling him the drifter nobody could vouch for, and started calling him, plainly and without the old suspicion in it, Gideon Voss of the Split Anvil, a name that had taken him 27 years and one long winter to grow into fully. Amos Teague stayed on as foreman under the new partnership, and it was Gideon himself, not Celia, who insisted on it over the objection of one hand, who thought the old foreman's early treatment of him deserved a longer memory than that. "He gave me the worst fence on the place, because he didn't know me," Gideon told the hand plainly. "A man's allowed his caution before he's earned his trust. I'd rather keep a foreman who tests a stranger honestly than one who flatters whoever holds the deed." He kept his father's pocket watch on him always after that, and kept, too, the habit Nathaniel had never lived to see fully repaid, of judging a man by his hands and his conduct before he judged him by anything a lawyer or a rumor could put on paper. He never once used the ranch or the name against Amos Teague or against any hand who had doubted him that first summer, choosing instead, the way his father had chosen with him, to let a man's later conduct speak louder than his earlier suspicion. When word came, the following autumn, that Roland had failed at a fourth venture in Cheyenne and stood near ruin, it was Gideon, without consulting Celia first though she agreed at once when he told her, who sent a portion of the season's cattle sale east under a lawyer's careful anonymity. Unsigned, the same way support had once reached a Council Bluffs farmhouse for 18 quiet years before a boy grew old enough to wonder who had sent it. Split Anvil prospered under the two of them in the years after, its herds larger and its water rights secured the way Nathaniel had always meant them to be. And on quiet evenings Gideon would sit on the same porch where his father had once watched a hailstorm through a dead wife's spyglass, and think, without bitterness now, of a man who had waited 40 years and then one careful summer more to say the truth out loud, and had run out of time by 3 weeks. It was not the whole of what either of them had wanted. It was, in the end, enough to build the rest of a life on, the way most things worth having in that country were built, out of what arrived late and imperfect, rather than what arrived exactly as a person had once hoped it would. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.